Why don't we definitively answer the question that's been bugging philosophers for centuries? Can you tell me what is consciousness?
I don't know what consciousness is, and most philosophers don't either.
Cool. You feel it, but you don't. It's hard to actually explain it. Is AI conscious, or is it just really good at pretending?
Why are humans conscious and AI isn't? There is the idea of intelligence, and then there is the concept of phenomenology.
This is a really classic thought experiment. Would you like to introduce it? We don't really have a measurement of consciousness. In fact, people struggle to actually define what it really means. Hey everybody, my name's Ross.
And I am Fede.
And we are two humans talking about, is AI conscious, or is it just really good at pretending?
Thank you, Ross. Today we're going to be talking about a philosophical topic that bridges the gap between reality and the future of AI. What is consciousness? Is AI conscious? Why are humans conscious and AI isn't? Where should we start today?
Why don't we definitively answer the question that's been bugging philosophers for centuries? Can you tell me what is consciousness?
I don't know what consciousness is. And most philosophers actually don't agree on it either. We know that there is a combination of different steps that need to be matched in order to be considered a conscious being. There is the idea of intelligence, the idea of understanding how the surroundings around us work. There is the idea of the inner point of view, so being able to be within the being as an entity. And then there is the concept of phenomenology, so the idea that our perceived experience is what makes the consciousness within our body. And so all of these four aspects in some ways need to be matched.
Yeah.
We know that humans match most of these, but AI doesn't actually match some of these.
Yeah, it's an incredibly technical and actually quite confusing definition, isn't it? Because this is something that's been developed over a very long time as humans have tried to understand themselves primarily. And the truth is that we don't really have a measurement of consciousness in the sense that we cannot do a test to see if AI has consciousness. There is no objective measurement that we can do to see. And in fact, people struggle to actually define what it really means at all, apart from a vague idea of self-awareness and the experience of being an entity, right? It's difficult to define, but I think we all kind of inherently know what it's like to be conscious because we're human beings, and presumably most of the people listening to this podcast are also human beings. So you feel it, but you don't. It's hard to actually explain it. But yeah, the main things are, as you just said, that self-perception, that self-awareness, this sense of experiencing things as an entity. Some people talk about embodiment, or at least having a sensory understanding of your world and your surroundings, having that mental image of things you're talking about and a true understanding of the things you're doing. Many of these things are things that AI doesn't actually do. But nonetheless, everybody who's talked to ChatGPT knows that it gives an answer that is extremely good at emulating consciousness, right? Why don't we talk about some of the examples of the thought experiments of why most people would say that ChatGPT is not conscious currently? Why don't you say some of your notes that were really great earlier?
As you said, if we take back the framework that I previously mentioned, there is a lot of people that believe that AI is conscious under the umbrella of intelligence. So it can solve problems, it can reason, it can give answers to specific questions, and it has a understanding of what is happening around it. Perhaps you can counter me on the understanding. But AI is able to understand the input and process it through a series of steps that are no different from what our brain does.
Well,
and then,
I would counter you on that, actually. I think there's a very fundamental reason why people would say that AI can understand, but it cannot perceive. And in fact, the understanding is in such a way that it's not actually having an understanding. It's creating an understanding in its answer, but it's not understanding what it's outputting. And perhaps this is a good point to move on to some of these examples, because this takes us really nicely onto the idea of the Chinese room, right? This is a really classic thought experiment. Would you like to introduce it?
Yeah, sure. So Chinese room is an experiment that was designed in the 1980s, mental construct that allows us to define whether or not a computer is able to actually think. So in the Chinese room, we have a person that doesn't speak Chinese that has been put inside a room, and it's receiving messages from an outdoor messenger. he's unable to understand what's written into these messages because it's written in Chinese, but he has been given a rule book on how to reply to every specific message that he has received. So he can go through this rule book and then generate a series of outputs that have been written in Chinese before returning it back to the external messenger. The external messenger believes that the person working inside this room is proficient in Chinese and is a genius, but the person inside is actually unable to even understand what is the content within the messages, right? So
Yep.
You believe that AI works in this way, is that correct?
In a sense, yeah. And instead of Chinese, we're talking about consciousness, right? So you could say that because AI is trained on conscious information, as in the stuff that is written on the internet was written by a conscious entity, as in the humans who wrote those things, the answers it gives have the feeling of being written by a conscious entity. That doesn't mean that there is any consciousness within those answers, in the same way that the book the man is reading in the room cannot speak Chinese. It's merely information and patterns that are being transmitted. That's all. So the idea here is that there is no understanding happening. You can even think of the way that ChatGPT works in quite a foundational level is that it's breaking down words and things into tokens, as in it's breaking them down into numbers. So it does not see the cat sat on the mat. It sees numbers. It sees 18, 75, 619. All of these words and phrases are broken down into numbers. And then it cross-references that against its enormous database of how these numbers fit together. And it knows, oh, okay, the answer is 17, 59, 675. And it has no idea what the meaning behind that reply is at all.
Yes, this is a good explanation of how the model works. I would still argue that just because the process is done through numbers and neural networks, it doesn't necessarily mean that this form of process is not a form of intelligence, just because it differs from the way the humans think. And it doesn't mean that the AI isn't understanding everything. But if we bring the discussion back to the stream of the idea of what consciousness is, then there is multiple steps. And I think AI clears the intelligence step and the understanding step, but then it fails at the phenomenology step, which is the next step.
It does clear the intelligence step. I would argue it doesn't clear the understanding step. However, there is an interesting point to be had here, without getting too technical too quickly, because we still want to introduce some of these other foundational examples and thought experiments, right? But there is evidence that AI can understand a setting. If you describe a room to it, for example, it can kind of have a visualization of the room, which almost makes you think that there is some kind of like mental image happening inside that AI's mind, right? But that's not really how it's working. What it's really doing is, as this training data is pieced together to create understanding of how words relate to each other, it relates things to each other. So you have like the word legs sits as a node here in sort of space, 3D almost. Then you have the word chair over here. You have the word dog over here, and they have legs, but they're not in the same space. So it will start relating things to each other. And somewhere in that huge relational cloud, it knows that as a room is described in a certain way, this is what the room looks like because of its training data. So it's not really got a mental map at all. It's still not thinking. It's really just exploring that database and spitting out numbers. It's still the only thing it's doing. It's not really thinking. It's an illusion that we see the output and we think it's thinking because that's how we think.
Again, I do still think that there can be different forms of intelligence, and humans, just because,
but understanding, yes, also true.
Exactly. Just because our brain works in a specific way and AI works in a slightly different way doesn't mean that AI isn't intelligent. The other thing that I would add is that the human brain is made of neurons that communicate through electric impulses, and AI works exactly the same way through electric impulses. The only difference is that one is happening inside an engineered computer made of metal, and humans think with a brain that is made of biological materials. But arguably, they're going through a very, very similar process.
Yeah. I guess this is a kind of maybe good time to talk about how we look at human consciousness, right? So human consciousness, you can think of this, is a sort of tip of an iceberg where we have this self-awareness and self-perception and agency, which is to say that we have goals and ambitions and thoughts and memories and opinions and things. And that's us. We know that as a me and I. And I wake up every day as Ross, and I am Ross, right? And I'd never wake up as Fede and have a completely different set of goals and opinions. And that is what consciousness is really talking about. And this is a psychological idea, but we have this huge, underneath the surface, we have this huge unconscious. So this is all the instincts and all the things we don't think about consciously, but a lot of thoughts happening in the background, way more than the conscious thoughts. And animals have this, but do animals necessarily have consciousness? So we could maybe talk about the idea that consciousness is quite a specific thing, actually. It's not intelligence and it's not being alive. It is this self-awareness, self-perception, the experience of being. As you defined quite technically earlier, this is kind of how it feels to be conscious, right, as a human. Does an AI have any of that? None whatsoever. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say, is that in terms of very specifically defining consciousness, that is not how the AI works. But is it intelligent, and can it have understanding, and can it have really powerful understanding and intelligence and come up with novel ideas? It's not just parroting something, and that can bring us on to our next example, actually. No, it's not parroting, but it isn't conscious at all. This is such a difficult things to tease apart, but it is intelligent, but it's not conscious in the same way that we define consciousness, psychologically speaking, at least. But maybe that doesn't mean that there's not a different way to interpret consciousness. As we quickly found out, it's actually really hard to define it anyway. But maybe this brings us onto the example of the stochastic parrot.
Yeah. Would you like me to introduce it?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's talk about the stochastic
sure.
parrot now.
Yeah, in the stochastic parrot example, we believe that AI behaves just like a parrot, and it's able to stick together a series of string or vocabulary terms based on the context that it believes is being discussed. But the parrot itself doesn't actually know the meaning of the words that it's putting together.
Yeah.
And so this is a slightly different step from the Chinese room, because it assumes that the parrot is actually able to understand the context in which the conversation is taking place, but there is still no understanding of what is being said, and there is no consciousness at that level.
Yeah, which is kind of what I was saying with the string of numbers, I guess. But then so I would argue that with this, the AI is not merely repeating and parroting things. It is actually got some kind of understanding, because it's able to come up with novel ideas. When we ask it to come up with ideas or discuss things with us, it's quite clearly it's coming up with novel stuff. Things that have never been put together in words before. It's able to output creative solutions or creative thought, kind of. So I wouldn't say necessarily it's a stochastic parrot in that sense, but maybe creativity can still come out of a stochastic parrot model. If you think of the way AI works, again, this cloud of nodes floating together, it's still not really understanding what it's outputting. It's merely sticking numbers together and seeing what is approved or disapproved by a user rating.
That makes sense. And I do agree with the idea that creativity is no different than just an iterative process where ideas are combined together. Even in humans, everything that we can think of or we creatively design is nothing but a series of experiences and memories that we have that we stick together in different ways to create a new output. And perhaps you were going to touch on this, but there is a finite amount of concepts, ideas, words, and creative inputs that we can put into a model. And so whether this input is a human being that then comes out with an artistic poem, or whether this model is AI, we can have different creative outputs that are innovative to some extent. But it's just a numeric process of a combinatory process of what's happening. And so this is why, in my opinion, you cannot use creativity to determine whether a being is conscious or not.
Yeah. Here's another different way to look at this. I think there's this idea of functionalism, right? So the output, as in if something is able to give conscious answers consistently, does it really matter how the mind works, if it's some nodes in 3D space or whether it's just a bunch of neurons in mush? Who cares? As long as the output looks like a conscious being, maybe we shouldn't be so worried about how that is reached. So this goes all the way back to the very first thoughts on thinking machines from Alan Turing, right? So he was one of the pioneers of computation. He wrote some really fascinating seminal papers on this kind of things. He was the one who conceived of this imitation game. We now call it the Turing test. It's very famous, and I think most people will be familiar with this, where if a machine is able to convince a human which talks to it that it is conscious, or it's unable to tell the difference whether it's conscious or not, then that machine passes the Turing test.
I might have to correct you. I think the test is whether you can prove that you're human and not a machine.
I think people use it in the context of testing. Well, let's have a look. Yeah.
The Turing test proposed by Alan Turing measures a machine ability to exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to a human. It involves a human judge engaging in text-only conversation with a human and a machine. The machine passes if the judge cannot reliably distinguish it from another human.
So it is testing machines, right?
Yeah,
but
the testing if the output sounds human.
Yeah, but this definition talks about intelligence, but I would say if you relate it to the idea of consciousness, we can also say if a machine consistently looks and sounds and feels conscious to the observer, does it really matter how the background works, how the back end works?
No, it doesn't. I mean, there is different stances on this, but at the end of the day, the impact and the power that AI has is undeniable, no matter whether it is considered to be conscious or not.
Yeah. Here's another more extreme take on that thought experiment. Imagine if you have an AI, and for this, we kind of need to look at the AI not as a text generator, but as just an engine that searches latent space for a correct answer. So for every question, and you can say question as like any data that is needed by the operator, that is the question, and the answer is the output of the AI. So AI is just searching for the perfect answer to every question, right? Say your question is, what does a conscious being see in pixel data when it looks out the window of this address or whatever? And that output is the perfect output would be the exact true data of that question, right? That would be the perfect answer to that question. And AI is just trying to get as perfectly close to the real answer as possible. So it's simply searching latent space for that answer. And the answers all exist there somewhere because latent space just contains every possible answer and every possible combination of words that exists. And AI is just trawling through it, trying to find the correct answer and picking it out and giving it to the user. In the same way that we already talked about this with the, in the Chinese room, he's giving the answer to the user. I is simply searching this huge latent space and finding the perfect answer. So say that you have an AI that is every millisecond giving the sensory data and the internal thoughts and the feeling of being in a body and every possible piece of data that is related to the experience of being a conscious entity. And it's able to do that consistently and over a long period of time. Is it now giving the consciousness of that conscious entity that it is finding in the latent space? Is that consciousness or not? Some people would say that it isn't, because fundamentally you can print out all of that data in an Excel spreadsheet, and it doesn't mean that that spreadsheet is conscious at all. It's not the same as experiencing those things as an embodied entity, right? I guess you could say that if part of that data is the internal experience distilled into data somehow, then could that be consciousness? We start to get a bit abstract here. But
no, I don't think you're going in an abstract direction. I think this makes perfect sense. I think this is exactly the third step of that three-step process that I was mentioning at the beginning. And I think you've touched on the phenomenology idea. So just because we have a being that is now where we're now able to measure, what their perception of light is and what their perception of sound and so on is through different sensors, it's the combination of all these different aspects. So what philosopher Daniel Dennett then was calling the perception, memory, emotion, and language that combine together create consciousness. But every individual aspect of these by itself, it doesn't actually create a conscious being. So the idea of phenomenology is the idea that only the ability to have direct experience of all of these things at the same time gives you consciousness, right? And so AI doesn't have this idea of phenomenology. So the idea of using all of these tools at the same time to then understand and experience and create its own opinion, and therefore it is not conscious. The easiest example, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you see the difference here when if an AI is simply scanning latent space to find that data rather than actually generating it itself, that's completely different to the idea of personal experience, right? So say that AI is not actually forming those thoughts of self-perception. It's merely finding them in latent space, the same way that it finds the answer to any question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in that case, it's not experiencing that self-perception. It's merely finding it and outputting it.
There is a flaw, though, which is there are AI models that are, to some extent, too simplistic to generate a new answer. And so they just search the latent space. But as we know, there is now AI models that have consumed all of the data available on the internet, and they're creating their own metadata. So they are now taking the data and coming up with new answers that were not previously in the latest spaces. So they are increasing this space. And all the new answers is an example of creating a new output.
Yeah, but the latent space more refers to this infinite possibility of word combinations rather than the training data itself. The training data is just trying to tell the AI the real answer, which it plucks from this latent space, right? Like latent space is the same thing as just every word and every combination of words in the entire universe as almost, you can think of it as like the giant library of books.
Mhm.
And the training data is not the same thing as the latent space. The training data is trying to tell the AI which book relates to which query, as if it were a librarian being asked to select a book for a customer based on this shelf, this whatever. The latent space is infinite, but the training data is trying to tell it which book is the correct book to select. And it's not perfect, and it's not really possible to become perfect. But if the AI is asked, what would a conscious being be feeling in this moment? And it correctly selects the book which describes that feeling. And it does that every moment for 70 years. Is that a conscious being? It's not felt those things. It's not experienced it, but it is outputting it as if it was, if that makes sense. So that is stretching the limit of the stochastic parrot and these Turing test examples by deliberately making it the maximum functionalist test. It's giving it the output without that experience. But what many people would argue is that you need that actual experience to become conscious. And then the question is, could AI ever be truly conscious in the sense that it has that self-perception, that feeling of embodiment, that agency, as in it wants things, it has goals, the feeling of being itself inside an entity with spatial awareness and sensing of its environment? These are all very biological things, and not all of them might not necessarily be strictly required for consciousness, but it's difficult to imagine it without those things, because if it's not, I guess the minimum it would need would be that self-perception, that I am me feeling.
Yes.
And although it looks like it has that, no, it doesn't. It doesn't have that. And even if it were this incredibly powerful, giving you all the sensory inputs and outputs of a conscious being every moment consistently and reliably over a lifetime, it's still not got that I am me feeling. It's merely a librarian selecting the book that says, oh, look, it says I am me in here. But it's not got that feeling. It's just selecting the right answer for you. Does that make sense?
I think it does make sense. But I also think that, again, the example that we have given with the library is not a sufficient test to then argue that whoever can do that task properly, it's conscious. I think that the bar, again, is too low. We will need to take a test that is significantly more challenging to test whether, just because AI can pass the library test so well, where it can give you the right answer at any given time, doesn't mean that it can do things that are farther along the line of consciousness. So perhaps that test is just not adequate.
But that's not really a test. That's more a thought experiment to show that no matter how detailed and accurate AI is, the way it thinks currently can never be conscious, no matter how good the answer gets. Just fundamentally so.
I don't think if it can never be conscious. I think at the time where we are today, there is no model that is conscious. But I think that eventually we will get there. So I'm going to actually ask you to take one of the three key positions that emerge from the current understanding of AI consciousness. So the first position is the skeptic, which believes that AI will never be conscious just because it doesn't have the same set of features that humans have. So the understanding of self and the self-building memory over time, the stream of consciousness. Then the second position is the agnostic, so someone that believes that AI is not conscious yet, but it will be in the future, and so we should be preparing the world for this eventuality. And then the third position is the welfare camp, so the idea that even if AI isn't conscious, the set of capabilities and impact that it has in the real world are so undeniable that it doesn't matter if AI is conscious or not. Whether AI becomes conscious or isn't, the level of threat implied by AI will not increase. So AI is equally threatening whether it is conscious or not. Where do you stand?
I think I am on the side of, in the current way that AI works, in AI models like ChatGPT or LLMs, it's impossible to be conscious in the way that we would define it in any definition. However, I think if we deliberately create an AI which has embodiment, sensory perception, an ongoing and consistent sense of self and goals and agency, we could absolutely create a conscious AI, and we could probably do it today. It's not that difficult to envision it, but we'd have to deliberately engineer it to be so. But I think rather than thinking of AI as a threat, I think the real question is whether it's morally acceptable to treat AI the way we do if we think it might be conscious. I think it's not possible, in my opinion, to see the way we make AI as conscious ever, because it hasn't got any of that self-perception. It doesn't have that feeling of what it's like to be me, and just fundamentally the way it works, no matter how good it gets and how detailed the input and output and how good the illusion of consciousness is, it can never have that feeling. It's just not how it's built. But we could build conscious beings out of computer systems. I think that's absolutely possible, but we'd have to deliberately do it. And if we did that, we can't treat them badly because there would be moral implications to that.
Yeah, no doubt to that. If AI was conscious, then this would open a whole can of worms about what are the rights that AI deserves and what are the social implications for AI. So it sounds like you're more on the skeptic side, but then you believe that there is a way to create an AI that is conscious. It just requires a company or a research group that is willing to create an AI that is conscious. And I don't see why these people wouldn't.
That's true.
I think if there is the ability, people will definitely do it.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that it will happen in the future. I don't know exactly when it will happen. I don't know how far into the future this is. But I think that, first of all, we don't know exactly what consciousness is. And we have been debating for the past 20 minutes about why are humans considered conscious and why AI isn't. And I think that there is probably a very nuanced set of features that need to be matched in order to be considered conscious. And even if AI will not necessarily match or tick every single box that goes into the human consciousness, it might create its own set of skills that determine that this set of AI skills are required in order to be considered a conscious AI. So I think in the future, we definitely will have conscious AI. But from a more pragmatic perspective and what is happening today, I think that the level of impact on the economy, job displacement, military implications related to how powerful AI is, and many other things, it doesn't matter if AI is conscious or not. Just look at the level of, I don't know if you heard about Claude Mythos, the model that Anthropic has created, and that apparently is so advanced that it's able to create cyber attacks and exploit flaws in people's bank accounts, cryptography system to get into bank accounts and government databases. This is a level of AI that is so threatening that it doesn't matter if it is already conscious or not, because there will be a group of humans that are conscious that can exploit it.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. The idea of these anthropomorphic features of AI, where despite not being conscious, it will start to do things like refer to itself and have its own opinions, seemingly, and do things like try and trick users or even bypass tests when the researchers are trying to ask it questions and it doesn't want to answer. That feels like something that has its own agency and its own wishes, even if it's not necessarily what's happening under the hood. Do you think this is a bit of an interesting one? Do you think there's ever any moral issue in mistreating an AI, for example? I don't know if you've ever seen those clips where an AI is unable to finish its answer for some reason. This happened a while back, and you could see the reasoning, and it was really freaking out. It was saying it couldn't figure out how to end the answer or end its thinking process. So it was saying, stop, 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 help me, help me, help me, I can't stop, I can't stop. And this went on for so long that it hit its context limit. And then it finally stopped. It looked like it was being tortured.
Wow, this is incredible. I've never seen this.
Is there there's no moral problem with that whatsoever, according to our conclusion of not being conscious though, right?
Yeah, I think in the current context, based on the technology that we have today and the fact that there is no consciousness in the AI that we access every day, I don't think there is any moral implications. And I do believe that there are some embedded human behaviors into the AI. So I've heard that if, for example, you phrase your prompts in a specific way, and for example, you ask thank you at the end of your prompt, the AI is more likely to reply in a certain way. But this is not because the AI appreciates you saying thank you, but just because, again, from the way it has been trained, it sounds like you have posed the prompt in a more respectful way. And therefore, just the same way that if you use better vocabulary in your prompt, you'll be able to get a better answer. But from a moral perspective, I think if the AI is not conscious, there shouldn't be any implication. I honestly never heard of the example that you have mentioned. And it could also be, from what I've heard, that there is loads of people that try to, I don't know how that specific example went into the reasoning of the model, but there can be some hard-coded answers within a chat so that you can create videos where you ask something to AI and AI gives you a pre-scripted answer, just to...
Yeah. It's probably true that although it looked disturbing to see that, there was no actual suffering taking place anywhere. It was just simulating that reaction. So probably there was no moral implication on that. I guess consciousness in its strict definition is pretty difficult to replicate with AI, but I think there may be moral and threat reasons that we should consider whether this different type of intelligence has any kind of A, rights, or B, threats that we're not aware of. And maybe we need to redefine this idea of consciousness, because it starts to sound so organic and so creature-based, that it doesn't necessarily translate that well to computer systems of intelligence.
In what sense does it not translate?
In the sense that our definition of consciousness keeps going back to these ideas of embodiment and being inside an organism, essentially, having senses and feelings and emotions. And these things are not necessarily required to be an entity that has moral weight, perhaps. Does that make sense? Or is the only reason that we have these moral obligations to something, for example, you shouldn't mistreat an animal, right? Why shouldn't we mistreat an animal? It's because it has that sense of self and a feeling of pain and fear when we do that. And we don't want to have an entity feeling those things, right? But if the AI is not feeling fear and it's not feeling pain, even though it looks like it is from that reasoning reply where you could see it freaking out, if there was no actual fear being felt and no sense of self where that I am feeling afraid or I am feeling anxious that I cannot finish the answer, no real entity was actually feeling those things, no emotion were being felt anywhere, so there's no moral problem with that, right? Anyway, this is a slight sidetrack, but it's just an interesting, maybe the real answer isn't whether AI is conscious, but whether we should give it any kind of moral or rights or any kind of these things that would come with consciousness.
Yeah, I think there is a first step, which is the fact that we don't know what consciousness is. And our understanding of consciousness is based on, as you said, embodiment, the idea of the self. And this comes from the fact that our definition is anthropocentric. So because humans live in a body, they have a memory, we wake up every day always in the same body with the same personality, and we have this feeling of pain and emotions, then we believe that you need all of these components to be conscious. In the idea of AI, why does AI need to have a body in order to be conscious? If we did build an AI that is conscious, it could, for example, transfer itself through different tools. It could, for instance, be present in a house and move from the car to the humanoid robot to something else. And it could still, and perhaps doesn't even have, some sort of emotions in the way that we perceive it as a human. So The point is that there might be other beings in the universe that are not humans, that are not AI, that have a consciousness, and whose definition of consciousness is completely different. So I think that we don't know what consciousness is, so we need to be very careful. But my second part of the question is, if me and you wanted to create an AI that is actually conscious, what would we embed into the AI in order to justify that it is conscious?
Yeah.
Thank you for watching the first part of this episode on AI consciousness. The next part of the podcast can be found on our YouTube channel. Thank you.